This is a private view of a private view. Now look, for example, the cover has no titling on it. That's originally how I wanted the design cover of Meet the Beatles with the Beatles to look, without any lettering, because by that time I felt the Beatles were famous enough to be recognized for what they are, for how they look. So I managed to get the book approved by the publisher to do it without the titling. Now this is George and the first concert I saw at the Gaumont Cinema in Bournemouth in August. I think it's a valve microphone. This is a Ringo again in the same performance, also with interesting microphones, and again with his winning smile. Good old Ringo. This is John on television. This was the Beatles' first appearance on Southern television, a few days after I met them. And then this was John on a monitor, and these were the fans waiting outside the Albert Hall to try and see their heroes, their idols. This was Paul having to sign autographs in a dressing room, and his face was just a fooling around face, unusual for Paul. This was the Beatles arriving in Stockholm. They were given flowers. This image reflects the atmosphere of a dressing room on tour, with a boot and a teapot and cups of tea on a table, and George slumped in a corner. I can't say whose hands they are. John in concert, August 1963. George reflected in two mirrors in a TV dressing room. George, no, sorry, that's John. It could be anyone, the way he's dressed. John was always prepared to fool around. He saw these wigs and hats in the TV makeup department and put them on, and this was shot into a mirror of the dressing room in Southampton TV studios. This is Paul waiting for playback on the recording of With the Beatles. When you're recording an album, there is a lot of waiting around because technicians are making adjustments and the musicians like to play, but they have to do a lot of waiting to hear what they've played. John likewise, waiting. This is the Beatles on, this can't get into one page. This is, well again, Wingo Commander, Ringo waiting for playback. This is Maestro George Martin with his beautiful right hand up to his cheek, with George watching Norman doing a mix on the highly modern 4-track mixing machine. Recording machine, mixing machine. These were the 4 boots of the Beatles I borrowed for one night to do like a still life arrangement of the boots, and you can see inside each boot the name of the boot owner: George, John, Ringo, Paul. They were made by Anello and David, a company that made shoes for ballet dancers, so the boots were very comfortable. This is the Beatles. These are the Beatles standing on a wall outside the town hall in Stockholm. I sent a picture of the King and Queen of Sweden, saying you can clearly see this is taken in Sweden by the wall they are standing on. Brian at work, Brian Epstein in the mirror of his salon. Brian waiting with Ringo like the best man. He was the best man at Ringo's wedding in London. This is the Meet the Beatles album cover. The American version, Meet the Beatles, had a blue tint to it, which I quite liked. I didn't like the reproduction of the English version, which looked like it was taken in a coal cellar. This is a treatment I did of the Hard Day's Night album cover, which I like. This was the one taken in Hyde Park for Beatles for Sale over a short period of time at the end of the day without any big production, but it's one of my favorite pictures of the Beatles. This was in Salzburg, Austria, filming Help, and was a sequence arranged by Dick for the filming, and was the seed of the idea for their album cover, which was intended to reflect the four letters Help. Rubber Soul, here I printed in sepia version because in the original album cover I didn't have the quality of color I really wanted for production reasons. This is John in the corner of a dressing room in Birmingham on their first tour, 1963. Paul in early '64, beginning to look more confident. One of the first portraits I did of Ringo a few days after meeting them in Bournemouth. A portrait of John, taken at the time for his book and of Hard Day's Night, both of which were produced in 1964. This was an image of John in disguise during the filming of Help, which I was asked to do for the Sunday Times Colour magazine. This is the entrance to John's apartment in London. I lived on the second floor, he lived on the third floor. The reason for all the marks on the paint was that fans were, once they discovered that he was living there, were writing and scrawling messages on the door. 13 Emperor's Gate. This is a contact sheet of portraits for the cover of John's book In His Own Right, published in 1964. This is John in 1965 with his Elvis look. This shot was done for promotional books, which I was asked to do by Brian to accompany their tours of America. This was shot in 1965 in the bedroom of John's new house in St. George's Hill Estate. He had a Japanese screen put into the room, which was the whole house was designed specially to John's instructions, and the panda was a gift to his son Julian, which was in the bedroom. So I said, John, grab the panda, let's do the picture. That was it, in his bedroom, 1965. This is the arrival in New York in 8:30 in the morning. I managed to get off the plane because I knew if I stayed on the plane, like Harry Benson, I wasn't going to get the shot. It's probably the combination of the Beatles' reaction is the happiest moment professionally of their career, which is a reaction to seeing all the fans crowding the roof of what was then called Idlewild Airport. This was the concert in Washington, in a sports stadium. They were peppered by jelly beans by the fans. Now this was taken on in the viewing theatre, at the entrance of the viewing theatre where they went to see the daily rushes of the film, and I thought it would be interesting to include the Beatles as if they looked part of this montage of old movie stars. This is a sequence of fans chasing the Beatles into Marylebone Station in London. This is Ringo fooling around on set with Dick Lester in the bottom right-hand corner. And this is the continued sequence where the Beatles are being chased into the station by the fans and they jump onto the train. I was on the tracking vehicle with the camera next to Dick Lester so I could capture this movement and this angle. This is Victor Spinetti with Paul and Dick Lester on set in Twickenham Studios. An element of the poster for Hard Day's Night. A portrait for John's book cover in his own right. This is the book cover for A Spaniard in the Works. This is Brian preparing Ringo for his wedding. Ringo and Maureen. Then during the next film, they're on Huntington Hartford's estate. This is another sequence from the film of Help. Ringo waiting for action in the water. Beatles picnic, Beatles underwater. Beatles filming Help. This is again a good moment because it reflects the Beatles being happy at the end of their film career, running along Paradise Beach in unity. George having a smoke at a cabin in Nassau. John in the painting studio of his new house in London. John liked painting, a legacy of his art school days, so he arranged one room into a studio. Paul animated, Paul with his Elvis look, George reflective, Ringo, portrait, 1965, Ringo. This was what I wanted to do for the Revolver album cover, which was the size of an LP, with a hole in the center, everything in proportion, with portraits of the Beatles that I'd taken before, arranged in a repetition, going into the perspective like the barrel of a revolver. John recording Revolver, John on guitar during Revolver, Ringo still waiting for playback, Ringo behind all the equipment, dominated by equipment. And this is one of my favorite pictures of the Beatles, which was taken by climbing a tree in Hyde Park after shooting the cover for Beatles for Sale. And I don't know, it just seems to have a whimsical feeling about it, and I think it's probably one of my favorite pictures of the Beatles. We're coming to the back cover of the book, which reflects in negative the front cover. This has been a private view of a private view by Robert Freeman.